Hello class, Mr. Long here. Today we are going to do a video lecture on a very brief overview of the Cold War, which obviously is going to come directly after the ending of World War II. So the picture that you are looking at right now on the screen, of course, is a picture. Half the picture is of the U.S. flag, and the other half of the picture is of the Soviet Union flag. So this should be a good indication of what the Cold War was all about, or at least who it was between. It was going to be between the United States, and it was also going to be between the Soviet Union. Now, the reason it's called the Cold War is because the U.S. and the Soviet Union never actually fought each other. They never physically fought each other, although they were involved with other countries that fought against each other. The Soviet Union and the U.S. never fought against each other, so it was given the nickname the Cold War because nothing actually happened physically between the two countries. So where we left off last is World War II and the end of World War II. We should all know that the Axis powers, which was made up of Italy, Germany, and Japan, loses World War II to the Allied powers, which was made up of the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union and many other countries. Now Germany will surrender in Europe, but we should know that Japan is the last country on the Axis power side to surrender. Okay, so they're going to meet. When I say they, there's going to be a couple countries that meet to discuss what will happen in the world after World War II ends. But we'll get there in a little bit. So just a few notes in regards to a little bit of a review of what is going on in Europe and what is going on around the world. So the United States and the Soviet Union don't necessarily have a good relationship with each other. They don't really like each other for really two reasons. The United States does not like the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin because if you remember, Joseph Stalin signed the non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler in 1939, right before World War II breaks out. If you guys remember, according to this non-aggression pact, the Soviet Union will help invade Poland from the east when Germany is invading Poland from the west. And as a result of that, the Soviet Union will receive lots and lots of land that they lost after they withdraw in World War I, years before. So the United States was not happy at all with the Soviet Union. They were not happy with Joseph Stalin. They did not trust them because of this non-aggression pact. And of course, vice versa, the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, is upset with the U.S. for not invading German-occupied Europe earlier than 1944. So if you guys remember during World War II, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union wanted the Allied powers, which was their friends, to attack Germany from the other side to relieve a little bit of pressure on the Eastern Front, which is in the Soviet Union. And the United States decided not to attack Germany as early as Stalin wanted them to. So at this point, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, they don't have a great relationship with the United States. So what ends up have to happen is there has to be some sort of meeting, a big meeting. And this is known as the Yalta Conference, and Yalta is located in the Soviet Union. So in February 1945, the leaders of the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union meet at Yalta. And they will decide how to divide up Germany, and they're going to divide up Germany into 4 different zones. And each zone will be controlled by another country. So those countries that will control those zones will be the Soviet Union, France, Britain, and the United States. Germany was also going to be forced to pay the Soviet Union for the loss of life and property. If you guys can remember, during World War I, Germany was forced to pay the war reparations for all the damages that they caused during World War I. But if you can remember, that kind of backfired because Hitler will use that as bitterness and resentful and also angering the German people. And that actually sparks the rise of Hitler and the beginning of World War II. So 20 years later, they're going to be forcing Germany to pay for all the damages that they caused in the Soviet Union. Stalin, since the war, World War II is still going on at this point when they're meeting in the Yalta Conference, Stalin promised to join the U.S. in fighting against Japan. Japan is the last country standing on the Axis power side. And they promised the United States and the other allied powers that they would help fight against Japan until Japan surrenders. And Stalin also agrees on free elections in Eastern European nations. Now, if you can remember, the Soviet Union is a communist country. It is ran by one person, which is Joseph Stalin, and he is considered a dictator. It's a totalitarian country, which means the government controls every aspect of the citizens' lives. There's no rights, there's no freedoms in the Soviet Union, and there's definitely no elections, which means anyone that wants to run against Joseph Stalin, it's not going to happen because they are not allowed to. So according to this Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin has to allow free elections in all the countries in Eastern Europe that border the Soviet Union. So here's a picture of the big three. That's what we call them. On the left, starting on the left-hand side, is Winston Churchill of Great Britain. In the middle is FDR of the United States. And of course, on the right side is Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Now, this is a good visual, everyone, of how they are going to divide up Germany after World War II. So obviously it's color coordinated. The red represents Germany that's occupied by the Soviet Union. The yellow goldish color is the area or zone that's occupied by the United States. The blue area is occupied by France. And of course, the green area is occupied by Great Britain. And then you guys are going to notice also in the red section or zone, which is controlled by the Soviet Union, you're going to have a little area that has all three colors. And that is Berlin. And we're going to talk about what happens in Berlin later on in this video lecture. Okay, so our next slide is very important because this is very, very similar to what happens after World War I also. If you guys can remember, after World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles, they created the League of Nations, which was Wilson's 14-point plan. That was his last point. And according to that, the League of Nations is just a group of countries that get together and maintain peace around the world to make sure that another world war doesn't break out. So after World War II, they have to refine the League of Nations, and they create what is known as the United Nations. And the United Nations consists of 50 countries that formed an international organization to protect members against aggression. So any country that belonged to the United Nations will be protected by the other 49 countries. So they, once again, create the United Nations to make sure another major war doesn't break out again, kind of like what they did with World War I and the League of Nations. So United Nations is going to be made up of two parts. You're going to have the Security Council. And the Security Council is made up of an 11-member body which have the power to investigate and settle disputes. So a dispute is like an argument. So if two countries are having an argument with each other, the Security Council will go in, which is made up of 11 members, each member from a different country, and they will settle the argument. They will settle the dispute to make sure that another war does not break out again. Okay, so there's the first part, the Security Council. And then you're going to have the 5 permanent members that belong to the United Nations. The 5 permanent members are like the big bosses, okay? And you're going to have 1 member from the following countries: Great Britain, China, France, the US, and the Soviet Union. And the job or the responsibility or duty of the 5 permanent members is to veto or reject Security Council actions. So once again, Security Council will settle disputes between countries. Now, whatever compromise or whatever idea they come up with to settle that argument or dispute, that will then go to the 5 permanent members. And it's like they vote on it. And it's either yes or no. And if it's yes, then it's almost like a law that's passed, and then they settle the dispute. If it's no, the Security Council will go back and try to renegotiate to find out a solution to the problem between the countries, whoever they're dealing with. So very important. United Nations made up of 2 parts: Security Council and permanent members, and there's 50 countries in total that belong to United Nations. Okay, so in the very beginning of this video lecture, I mentioned the United States and the Soviet Union, how they really don't like each other, really for 2 reasons. But the United States and the Soviet Union have 2 very, very different ideologies, which means how they think and the way they run their country, and most importantly, their government. So let's talk about the United States first. The United States will 100% encourage democracy. They want governments all around the world to be a democracy. And remember what a democracy is. It's when you give power to the people, to the citizens, to vote, to elect government officials, to make decisions for the citizens. That's what a true democracy is when the actual people, the citizens, are involved. Now, if that means they're directly involved, or if they're indirectly involved by voting for people and electing people to make decisions for them. But the United States is all about democracy. And the United States' main concern is to prevent the spread of communist governments into other countries throughout not only the world, but more specifically Europe. Because remember, Europe just got done fighting in World War II. Just like with World War I, Europe, all those countries in Europe are very, very damaged at this point. Bad economies, land is ruined, they can't do any agriculture or harvest any crops. So countries in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and parts of Asia, throughout the world, all these countries that were involved in fighting in World War II, a lot of these countries are not doing well. So when a country is not doing well, they are easily influenced. And when I say easily influenced, that means a country like the Soviet Union can come in, give them food, give them supplies, give them money to kind of get back up on their feet and to start rebuilding their country. But there's always strings attached. If the Soviet Union is going to support these countries, you better believe that the Soviet Union wants these countries to turn into a communist country. Okay? Joseph Stalin's main concern and his goal is to get as many countries turned into a communist country as possible. That's what he wants. Okay? And the United States is doing everything in their power to not let that happen. Okay? So the United States wants to rebuild European governments to promote stability and to create new markets for U.S. goods. Of course, the United States will not just give out free money to these countries in Europe to rebuild themselves. Okay? There's some strings attached. As always, when you're giving money, you got to do some stuff. So this is the stuff that these countries have to do. Number one, most importantly, they have to rebuild, okay? And they cannot be a communist country. They have to be a democratic government. Once they rebuild and get back up on their feet and they're a democratic government, that means their economy is also up and running, which means when it's up and running, that country can do business with the United States. The United States can sell goods to those countries. So end result, of course, is the United States will be making lots and lots of money. The United States has a goal for Germany, and at a certain point, when Germany is ready, they want to reunite Germany. So in the previous slide, I showed you guys the map of Germany and how it was divided up into 4 different sections, each section being occupied either by the Soviet Union, the US, France, or Great Britain. The United States at some point wants all 4 of those countries to leave Germany and allow Germany to reunite and become one country again without any other country's influence in that country. Okay? That's what the United States wants from Germany. But of course, the United States' opinion, their view on what they want for Europe and Germany is very different from what the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin wants. So Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union wants to encourage communism as much as possible in any other country that borders the Soviet Union, that's in Europe, that's in Eastern Europe, any country that they can influence to become a communist country, the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin will do. The Soviet Union will rebuild the economy using Eastern Europe's industrial equipment and raw materials. Now this goes back to the Industrial Revolution. At this point, the Soviet Union is very industrialized, and they will use that to make money to help these countries get back up on their feet. But the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, once again, is just not going to give free money out. They're not just going to give loans out to countries and not expect anything in return. So if you take money or you take assistance or support from the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, you will become a communist country. Control Eastern Europe to protect Soviet borders and balance the U.S. influence in Western Europe. So all this point is saying is that the United States is in Europe, they're spreading democracy. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union is doing the exact same thing in Eastern Europe, but they are spreading communism. Now, when it comes to Germany, Soviet Union wants to do the complete opposite. They want to divide or keep Germany divided. And they want to keep Germany divided for one reason, to keep them weak. They don't want Germany to reunite again, to rebuild themselves just like they did in the 1930s with the rise of Adolf Hitler, and they don't want Germany to start another war. So they want to keep Germany divided up into those 4 sections to keep them weak. So what ends up happening is there is a nickname that is given to what is happening in Europe at this time, and it's called the Iron Curtain. This is something that was actually described by Winston Churchill. I'm going to skip down to the very last point, and then I'll work my way back up. But this was a term that was stated by Winston Churchill, and he described the division of Europe as an iron curtain. So it's not something that you can physically see. It's not a big iron wall. It's not that at all. It's an imaginary line. But that iron curtain divides Europe in half. You're going to have Western Europe, which is influenced by the United States, which are democratic governments. And then you're going to have Eastern Europe, which is influenced by the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, and all those countries are communist countries. Okay? So working our way back up to the very top, Stalin wanted to install a wall of protection between Western Europe. He does not want the United States, he does not want Western Europe to influence whatsoever the Eastern European countries and what is happening in Eastern Europe. Remember, His goal is to get as many countries to become a communist country as possible. So he wants this barrier, this iron curtain between the two, between Eastern Europe and between Western Europe. Joseph Stalin will install communist governments in the following countries: Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia. So all of Eastern Europe, for the most part, are now becoming communist countries after World War II. And of course, he is going to break the Yalta Agreement. If you guys remember a couple slides back, Joseph Stalin agreed to allow free elections in Eastern European countries. But remember, if you are a communist country, you are led by one person, a dictator. There is no way there is free elections in a communist country. So now Joseph Stalin, right off the bat, is breaking the Yalta Agreement, which is a big no-no, because now what he is doing is he is creating more and more tension between the United States and other Western European countries, which is not good. So this is a good political cartoon of the Iron Curtain. If you guys notice, it is labeled the Iron Curtain. Right above is the two symbols that are on the Soviet Union flag. One symbol is the hammer, and then that half moon with a handle is called a sickle, which is a tool that is used on farms. And then, of course, you have the hammer, which is going to be used in factories. So communist countries and governments are all about the workers. So that's why they have those two symbols, to represent the workers. And remember what a communist country is. There's no upper, middle, lower class. Everyone is considered to be the same. It's a classless society. So there's no rich people, there's no poor people, everyone is the same, which is the complete opposite of what the United States is promoting, which is capitalism. Being able to buy and sell goods, make a profit, but that's going to have an upper, middle, lower class, which is the complete opposite of communism. So if you guys notice, there's individuals. Each person in this political cartoon is labeled like the individual trying to lift up the Iron Curtain. She's actually a female, but she's labeled as the United Nations. She's trying to lift up that Iron Curtain. And then, of course, in the back, you have the United States, you have France, you're going to have Great Britain, and they are waiting for the Iron Curtain to lift up so those countries can go into Eastern Europe and to hopefully put down communism. But it's not going to work. So this is another good visual of what Europe will look like during the Cold War, right after World War II. The blue countries all represent U.S. influenced countries, which means democratic countries. All countries that are in red represents the Soviet Union influenced countries, which is the communist countries. And then the countries that are in gray are neutral countries. They don't belong to either side. They're not influenced by either the United States, or they're not influenced by the Soviet Union. So at this point, the United States needs to figure out a game plan. They need to figure out how to contain, how to stop the spread of communism and the Soviet Union's influence in Europe. Because if they don't, eventually communism will take over and the Soviet Union will start influencing countries in Western Europe. And they don't want that to happen, or even other parts of the world. And they don't want that to happen. So the United States comes up with a policy that is known as containment. And this is a foreign policy adopted by the U.S. to create a blockade of Soviet influence and to stop the expansion of communism. So think of a container. Okay, you put food in a container. You put the top of the container on. And what is the purpose of that? It's to make sure that nothing gets out, to make sure that that food doesn't spoil and that it stays in that container. The same idea here. If the United States can contain communism, put a top on that container, not allow communism to spread or expand, then they will be okay. So, two ideas that the United States comes up with in regards to containment. One is the Truman Doctrine, and the other one is the Marshall Plan. And both of these plans are going to cost the United States a lot of money. But they have one goal in mind: to stop the spread of communism. So the Truman Doctrine, of course, named after Harry Truman, who was the president at the time, he is going to spend $400 million to aid two countries, Greece and Turkey. Okay? Now, he is going to give $400 million between those two countries, Greece and Turkey, as long as Greece and Turkey agrees to reject communism. As long as those two countries don't allow communism to come in and be influenced by the Soviet Union and to accept democracy, they get the $400 million to rebuild their countries after World War II. Okay, so there's the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan is another idea, and it was an assistance program to needy European nations to rebuild after World War II. This is going to cost the United States even more money. It's going to cost them about $12.5 billion, and that's with a B, billion dollars, which is a lot of money. So any country in Europe that accepts money from the United States, from this Marshall Plan, there's one requirement: reject communism. As long as they are taking this money, they are not allowed to be a communist country. That is very, very important to understand. So after World War II, the United States is spending as much money as they possibly can to stop the spread of communism, which is the idea of containment through these two different policies, which is the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Now, there's going to be many, many different events that occur during the Cold War. The Cold War actually lasts for over 40 years. And this is just one event that occurs. And after this video lecture, you guys will all start researching major events that occurred during the Cold War, such as the Vietnam War, the Korean War, different events that occur around the world, but it has everything to do with the Cold War. But I want to specifically talk about the Berlin Airlift. Now remember, if you guys remember, I'm going to go back to this. Now the Berlin is located in that red section, which is controlled by the Soviet Union. But if you notice, that little area that has the four different colors is Berlin. Okay, so there's your visual of Berlin. Going back to our slide now. In 1948, the US, France, and Britain removed their military from Germany and allow their zones to form one nation. Okay, very important. 1948, Great Britain, France, and the United States leaves their section in Germany. And they allow Germany to unite those three sections once again to become one country. Okay? But the Soviet Union refuses to leave their section that they control. And they actually respond by holding West Berlin hostage. Now, we should all know what hostage means. They're not allowing those people to go. Okay? So what ends up happening is that the Soviet Union cuts off all highway, food, water, rail traffic into Berlin's western zones. So they completely shut off West Berlin. Nothing can get into West Berlin. Nothing can get out of West Berlin. Completely shut off to the rest of the world. So think about what they are attempting to do. When I say they, I'm referring to the Soviet Union. There's no supplies going in or out. Eventually, they're going to run out of necessities like food, water, supplies that you need on a daily basis to survive. So as a result of this, the US and Great Britain will fly food and supplies over West Berlin and drop them off. Literally, they will fly airplanes over West Berlin, and from the airplanes, they will drop off supplies to the people that are living in West Berlin to make sure that those people survive. Because the Soviet Union is completely shutting them off from the rest of the world. And if the United States and Great Britain does not come in and help or aid the people in West Berlin, all those people will die. Now, the United States and Britain will do this for 11 straight months. Finally, in May of 1949, the Soviets will lift the blockade. Just think about that, though. Every single day, multiple times a day for 11 months, the US and Britain will fly over food and supplies and drop them off in West Berlin, which is going to cost those two countries lots and lots of money. So to give you guys a visual of what is happening, so where all the arrows, if you guys can see the cursor, actually just see where those arrows are going. That is Berlin. So you have East Berlin, which is in red, and then you have West Berlin, which is in black. So the black area, West Berlin, is completely shut off from the rest of the world, no supplies coming in. So you guys notice those airplanes and those arrows is the routes that Great Britain and the United States would take in order to drop off those supplies. In May of 1948 to June of 1948, Allied planes took off and landed every 3 minutes in West Berlin. There was a total of 278,000 flights, and pilots brought in 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, medicine, and even Christmas gifts. Okay, so once again, for a little under a year, every single day, they would drop off supplies multiple times a day. As a result of this, the Cold War will divide the world. Okay, you're going to have one side that is United States democracy. You're going to have the other side that is the Soviet Union and communism. And the Cold War is a struggle between the US and the Soviet Union over political differences carried on by means short of military action or war. Now, I mentioned this in the very beginning of this video lecture. It's called the Cold War because there's really no fighting. Actually, I shouldn't say really. There is no fighting going on between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, there's almost fights or war that breaks out between the two countries, but there's never actual physical fighting between the two countries. But there's going to be lots of different wars that go on during the Cold War where countries are either going to be supplied by the US or they're going to be supplied by the Soviet Union. So they are indirectly playing a role in these different wars that occurred during the Cold War. So as a result of this, you're going to have two different groups. You're going to have NATO and you're going to have the Warsaw Pact. And this is two major, we can call them alliances, that are going to develop during the Cold War. So obviously you're going to have the US and democracy on one side, and you're going to have the Soviet Union and communism on the other side. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is a treaty or an agreement between Canada, US, and 10 Western European nations. Then you're going to have the Warsaw Pact, and this is an agreement between the Soviet Union, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. So once again, two major alliances during the Cold War. This just gives you guys a visual of NATO, of the Warsaw Pact. So all the green countries belong to NATO. All of the red or pink countries, they belong to the Warsaw Pact. And of course, the yellow countries, they are neutral countries. They don't belong to any side. As a result of this, during the Cold War, in the early 1950s, we got to remember that the United States, to end World War II, was forced to make the decision of dropping the first nuclear bomb, which is the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are two major cities in Japan, which directly ended World War II. But the U.S. is going to go back and they're going to start developing different types of nuclear weapons. In 1952, the U.S. tested the first hydrogen bomb, but very shortly after that, 1953, the Soviet Union will test the first hydrogen bomb. So now the United States has always had nuclear weapons, but they've created a new type of bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which is actually 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And you guys should all know the impact that the atomic bomb had on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right when that bomb hit and went off, 70 to 80,000 people instantly died. So now what we're saying is that the development of the hydrogen bomb is 1,000 times more powerful, which is a very, very scary thought, especially when two countries that don't like each other each have them. And that's going to bring us to the term of Brinksmanship. The U.S. and the Soviet Union went on the edge or the brink of war several times in the next 40 years of the Cold War, or a little over 40 years. But never once did they actually go to war directly with each other. But as a result of this, the United States and the Soviet Union are going to build up their military. And they are going to have a stockpile of weapons and nuclear weapons just in case a war breaks out between the two. They're going to be able to defend themselves. Okay, so that term Brinksmanship, very important, just meaning on the brink or the edge of war. A few years later, the Soviet Union and the United States are going to compete with each other in regards to outer space. Now, I need you guys to understand that the Cold War is just one big competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, the goal of the competition is to win. So each country will always try to one-up the other. If it's the United States developing the hydrogen bomb, it's going to be the Soviet Union developing 1,000 hydrogen bombs or more hydrogen bombs or bombs that are more powerful than the hydrogen bombs. So it's going to be a constant competition between the two countries. And in 1957, it's going to reach the skies or outer space. So in 1957, the Soviet Union is going to launch Sputnik, which is a satellite, this name of a satellite that goes into outer space. The U.S., as a result of that, is going to spend tons and tons and tons of money on science education. And they are going to be able to launch their own satellite, but not until a year later. So if we back up a little bit, the United States beat the Soviet Union when it came to the H-bomb or the hydrogen bomb. But now the Soviet Union is going to beat the United States when it comes to launching a satellite out into space. And as a result of this competition, what ends up happening is the United States and the Soviet Union are going to want to know what is happening in the other country. And there's going to be lots and lots of spying in those two countries. And one example specifically happened in 1960. The U.S. was flying secret planes over Soviet territory to spy on what the Soviet Union was creating or developing or making. And that is a big no-no. The United States is not allowed to fly over secretly another country like that. Just like the Soviet Union is not allowed to fly over the United States and spy on what the United States was doing. But the United States did do that in 1960. And the Soviet Union shot down the U-2 plane. And they actually captured the United States pilot that was flying that plane. So once again, this is just one more event that causes the United States and the Soviet Union to get very, very close to fighting each other in a war, but they don't necessarily go to war with each other. That's going to go ahead and conclude this video lecture. There's lots and lots of information in this video lecture. Please feel free to go back and re-listen or let me know if you have any questions about this. But you guys are now going to go into a lot more detail of specific events that occurs in the Cold War. And you guys will start your timeline for your project at this point.